Albert Fish did not look like a killer. He looked like someone's grandfather. And that was exactly why he was so dangerous. Before we continue, I want you to comment below. What psychological trait do you think makes someone capable of hiding evil behind a kind face? Drop your answer now. In the crowded tenements of 1920s New York City, a thin elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses and a soft voice moved through neighborhoods like smoke. He carried candy in his pockets. He spoke gently to children. He offered parents money for odd jobs, promised employment for their sons, invited their daughters to birthday parties. His name changed depending on who asked. Frank Howard, Albert Hamilton, Thomas. He was polite, religious, and forgettable. He was also one of the most psychologically disturbed killers in American history. Albert Fish was not driven by rage or impulse. He was driven by something far more calculated, something that had been growing inside him for decades. He did not simply kill. He orchestrated suffering with the precision of a composer writing a symphony. And when his victims were gone, he made sure their families would never stop suffering either. This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about how monsters are made, how they hide, and how they weaponize trust itself. Albert Hamilton Fish was born in Washington, D.C. in 1870. His father was 75 years old at the time of his birth, a fact that would later be cited by psychiatrists as potentially significant. When Albert was 5, his father died. His mother, unable to support him, placed him in St. John's Orphanage. What happened inside that institution would shape everything that followed. Fish later described the orphanage as a place of systematic brutality. Children were beaten regularly, often naked, in front of other children. The punishments were not merely physical. They were designed to humiliate, to break down identity, to create shame so deep it became part of the body itself. For most children, this would have been purely traumatic. For Albert Fish, something else happened. Pain became associated with arousal. Humiliation became linked to pleasure. The neural pathways that should have developed normally were twisted into something unrecognizable. By the time he left the orphanage, Fish had already begun to seek out pain deliberately. He would later claim that he started inserting needles into his own body as a teenager, pushing them deep into the flesh around his pelvis and genitals. He described the sensation as both agonizing and euphoric. Would you have recognized these warning signs if you had known him as a young man? Or would he have seemed like just another troubled person trying to survive? As an adult, Fish married and had 6 children. He worked as a house painter and handyman. Neighbors described him as quiet, deeply religious, and somewhat odd but harmless. He attended church regularly. He read the Bible constantly. He spoke about God with genuine fervor. His wife eventually left him, taking the children. She had discovered his increasingly disturbing sexual behaviors. But even she did not know the full extent of what was happening inside his mind. By the 1920s, Fish had developed a complex system of paraphilias that psychiatrists would later struggle to categorize. He was sexually attracted to children. He derived pleasure from inflicting pain. He also derived pleasure from experiencing pain himself. He had begun to develop cannibalistic fantasies, which he initially tried to suppress but eventually embraced. Most disturbingly, he had constructed an elaborate religious framework to justify everything. He believed that God spoke to him directly. He claimed that biblical figures appeared in his dreams and commanded him to punish children for their sins. He saw himself not as a criminal but as an instrument of divine will. This was not insanity in the traditional sense. Fish understood reality. He knew right from wrong. He simply believed he had been given permission to transcend those boundaries. He began targeting children in poor neighborhoods. He understood that desperate families were less likely to immediately involve police when a child went missing. He knew that in crowded tenements, children often played unsupervised. He recognized that parents working long hours had to trust strangers sometimes. He exploited every vulnerability with surgical precision. Fish's method was consistent. He would approach families, usually those with multiple children, and offer money or employment. Sometimes he claimed to be hiring boys for farm work. Other times he said he needed help with painting or construction. He always appeared respectable. He always had a plausible story. Once he gained access to a child, he would take them to an abandoned building, a rented room, or a remote location. What happened next varied. Some children were sexually assaulted and released. Others were tortured over extended periods. Some were killed. Fish later claimed to have attacked children in at least 23 states. He said he had victims in every state he visited. Investigators were never able to confirm most of these claims, but they also could not disprove them. What made Fish particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize. After committing an attack, he would return to his normal life. He would go to church. He would read his Bible. He would write letters to his children. There was no visible breakdown, no obvious psychological crisis. He simply continued. Do you think someone can commit such acts and still function normally in society? Or was there something people missed? On May 28, 1928, Fish read a classified advertisement in the New York World newspaper. Edward Budd, an 18-year-old from Manhattan, was seeking employment. Fish saw an opportunity. He arrived at the Budd family's apartment on June 3, 1928, introducing himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Long Island. He was well-dressed, polite, and grandfatherly. He told Edward he could offer him work on his farm for $15 a week, an excellent wage at the time. The Budd family was poor but respectable. Edward's father worked as a doorman. His mother kept a clean home. They had several children, including 10-year-old Grace, a bright, trusting girl who loved school and helped care for her younger siblings. Fish spent hours with the family, building trust. He told stories about his farm. He showed them money. He seemed legitimate. Then he mentioned that he was going to a birthday party for his niece that evening. He asked if Grace could come along. He promised to return her by 9 o'clock. Edward's parents hesitated. But Fish seemed so kind, so trustworthy. Grace was excited. They agreed. Fish left with Grace Budd at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She was wearing her best white dress. She was holding his hand. She would never return. Fish took Grace to an empty house in Westchester County, a property he had scouted weeks earlier. It was isolated, surrounded by overgrown vegetation, far from any neighbors. What happened inside that house was later described by Fish himself in testimony and written confessions. He strangled Grace Budd. He dismembered her body. He removed sections of flesh and wrapped them carefully. Over the following 9 days, he cooked and consumed parts of her remains. Fish described the process with disturbing detachment. He spoke about it the way someone might describe preparing a meal. He noted textures, tastes, cooking methods. There was no emotion in his recounting, no recognition of the horror he was describing. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a moment of lost control. This was deliberate, methodical, and planned. What do you think goes through someone's mind when they can describe such acts without any visible remorse? Is it possible to truly understand that kind of psychology? The Budd family reported Grace missing immediately. Police investigated. They interviewed Fish, who had given them a false name and address. The trail went cold. For 6 years, Edward and Delia Budd lived in agonizing uncertainty. They did not know if their daughter was alive or dead. They did not know if she was suffering somewhere, waiting for rescue. They could not grieve because they could not know. This is a particular kind of torture. It is the torture of imagination, of endless possibility, of hope that becomes its own form of suffering. Fish knew this. And in November 1934, he decided to end their uncertainty in the cruelest way possible. On November 11, 1934, Delia Budd received an anonymous letter. It was written in neat handwriting on plain stationery. It began without preamble. The letter described in explicit detail how Grace had been killed. It explained how her body had been dismembered. It described which parts had been cooked and how they had tasted. It noted how long the process had taken. It was written with the calm precision of a recipe. The letter was signed Albert H. Fish. This was not a confession driven by guilt. This was not an attempt to seek forgiveness or understanding. This was a deliberate act of psychological violence. Fish wanted Grace's mother to know exactly what had happened. He wanted her to visualize every moment. He wanted to replace her uncertainty with images so horrific they would never leave her mind. Would you have been able to continue living after receiving such a letter? How does a parent survive that kind of knowledge? The letter was Fish's mistake. The envelope was made from stationery that had been taken from a New York boarding house. The stationery had a distinctive emblem. Police traced it to a rooming house on East 52nd Street. On December 13, 1934, Detective William King arrived at the boarding house and found Albert Fish in his room. Fish was calm. He did not resist arrest. He seemed almost relieved. During interrogation, Fish confessed immediately. He provided details that only the killer could have known. He described other crimes, other victims, other locations. He spoke for hours, his voice never rising, his demeanor never changing. Medical examination revealed the extent of his self-harm. X-rays showed at least 29 needles embedded in his pelvic region, some so old they had begun to corrode. There were scars covering his body, evidence of decades of self-inflicted wounds. Psychiatrists who examined Fish were deeply divided. Some believed he was legally insane, driven by delusions and compulsions beyond his control. Others argued that he understood the nature of his actions, knew they were wrong, and chose to commit them anyway. The question was not whether Fish was disturbed. The question was whether his disturbance absolved him of responsibility. Albert Fish was tried for the murder of Grace Budd in March 1935. The trial lasted 10 days. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery. The public was fascinated and horrified in equal measure. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They had Fish's confession. They had the letter. They had testimony from psychiatrists who had examined him. They had physical evidence from the crime scene. The defense argued insanity. They presented Fish's history of self-harm, his religious delusions, his bizarre sexual practices. They argued that no sane person could have committed such acts. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Albert Fish guilty of murder in the first degree. When the verdict was read, Fish showed no reaction. He sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his expression blank. He was sentenced to death. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. He was 65 years old. Witnesses reported that Fish seemed calm as he was led into the execution chamber. He did not resist. He did not speak. He sat in the chair and allowed the guards to strap him in. When the switch was thrown, something unusual happened. The first jolt of electricity did not kill him immediately. It took longer than normal for him to die. Some witnesses later speculated that the needles embedded in his body might have affected the electrical current, though this was never confirmed. Fish's last words, spoken to the guards before the execution, were unremarkable. He expressed no remorse. He offered no apology. He simply acknowledged what was about to happen. Albert Fish is studied not because of the number of his victims, though that number may be significant. He is studied because of the nature of his crimes and the psychology behind them. Fish represents a particular type of predator, one who weaponizes trust, who understands social dynamics well enough to exploit them, who can maintain a facade of normalcy while harboring extreme pathology. He also represents something more disturbing, the deliberate extension of suffering beyond the act itself. The letter to Grace Budd's mother was not necessary for his gratification. The crime was complete. But Fish chose to inflict additional psychological damage, to ensure that the suffering would continue indefinitely. This suggests a level of sadism that goes beyond physical violence. It suggests an understanding of psychological torture, an awareness of how memory and imagination can be weaponized. Do you think Fish understood the full impact of what he was doing? Or was he so disconnected from normal human emotion that he genuinely could not comprehend the suffering he caused? Despite Fish's confessions, many questions remain unanswered. He claimed to have attacked children in numerous states over several decades. He provided details about some cases but remained vague about others. He sometimes contradicted himself. He sometimes seemed to be confabulating, adding fictional elements to real crimes. Investigators were never able to confirm most of his claims. Some of the children he mentioned were never reported missing. Some of the locations he described did not exist. Some of the timelines did not match. This raises a disturbing possibility. Fish may have committed more crimes than anyone knows, or he may have exaggerated his crimes to enhance his own sense of importance. Both possibilities are deeply unsettling. There is also the question of why he sent the letter. Psychiatrists have debated this for decades. Some believe he wanted to be caught, that the guilt had finally become unbearable. Others argue that he felt no guilt at all, that he simply wanted to relive the crime by forcing someone else to imagine it. The truth may be that Fish himself did not fully understand his own motivations. His psychology was so fractured, so distorted by decades of paraphilia and delusion, that even he could not articulate why he did what he did. Edward and Delia Budd lived the rest of their lives with the knowledge of what happened to their daughter. They knew how she died. They knew what was done to her body. They knew that her final moments were filled with terror and pain. This is the legacy of Albert Fish. Not just the deaths, but the permanent psychological damage inflicted on those who survived. Grace Budd's siblings grew up knowing their sister had been murdered and cannibalized. They carried that knowledge into their own families, their own relationships, their own understanding of the world. The other families, the ones whose children disappeared and were never found, lived with uncertainty. They did not know if Fish was responsible. They did not know if their children had suffered. They could not grieve properly because they could not know. This is what makes Fish's crimes particularly cruel. He did not just take lives. He took peace of mind. He took the possibility of closure. He took the ability to move forward. Albert Fish forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil. Was he born this way? Was he created by his environment? Could he have been stopped earlier? Could he have been treated? The evidence suggests that Fish's pathology developed gradually, shaped by early trauma, reinforced by repeated behavior, and eventually rationalized through religious delusion. He was not born a monster. He became one. But at what point did he cross the line from victim to perpetrator? At what point did his own suffering stop being an explanation and become merely context? These are not easy questions. They do not have clear answers. But they are necessary questions if we want to understand how people like Albert Fish exist and how they might be identified before they cause harm. If you had known Albert Fish as a neighbor, as a fellow churchgoer, as someone who seemed kind and harmless, would you have seen the warning signs? Or would you have been fooled like everyone else? What makes the Albert Fish case endure in criminal psychology is not the brutality alone. It is the calculated nature of the cruelty. It is the way he understood exactly how to maximize suffering, both during the crime and long after. He did not kill in a frenzy. He killed with planning and precision. He did not confess out of remorse. He confessed to extend the torture. He did not seek redemption. He sought to ensure that his victims would never be forgotten, that their families would never find peace. This is a particular kind of evil. It is evil that understands itself, that recognizes its own nature, and that chooses to continue anyway. Albert Fish died in 1936, but the suffering he caused continues. The families he destroyed never fully recovered. The children who survived his attacks carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. The investigators who worked his cases were haunted by what they learned. And we, decades later, are still trying to understand how someone could do what he did and still look like someone's grandfather. The most terrifying thing about Albert Fish was not that he was a monster. It was that he looked exactly like someone you would trust.